right, where are they going? Right.
Oh.
So I think we are now recording, Belinda.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Okay. So Jordan, the first thing that I would be really curious about is, so your journey to where you are right now, how would you define that?
Well, I would say it's a personal evolution, right? So as we go through life, it's about learning, but it's picked up some speed, and I have some significant events in that timeline, of course. To start, it's kind of a loaded question, but to start, we could just say that I was an eccentric young boy. I grew up in Michigan, and I had mental health parents. I was a mental health kid, so they were mental health specialists. And I fell in love with learning about the mind and how that worked even as a young boy, on learning how the mind worked. And I eventually went from being a jock to being a scholastic and studying neuroscience and how the brain worked. And having struggled with my own substance abuse tendencies as a young adolescent with alcohol and young adulthood, I actually ironically got into those life experiences led me into studying how alcohol works with rats, studying biopsychology at the college level. And so I started working on experimentation and biopsychology and addictions and how those worked at a behavioral level with rodents, even in my undergraduate in Grand Valley State in Michigan. And I really kind of fell in love with how the brain worked and how everything was put together. And I was like, this is it. This is what I wanted to do. So I decided to study the brain, and I ended up going to graduate school at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and getting my PhD in neuroscience. And I continued on with behavioral neuropharmacology, which is basically a fancy term for saying you use drugs and figure out how drugs affect behavior. And you
really
do that
learn about that one, huh?
Yeah. And we looked at relapse, and we looked at how the brain functions, how it changes function as a result of drug use, and how that change in brain function causes relapse, and what interventions you can do to block relapse in the rodent model. And so that's what I got my PhD in, was basically how that worked, especially with stress. So stress worked to cause relapse. And long story short, that was a very challenging, very rewarding process. And I was very glad to have had the experience looking back on it. And that was all I felt was a divine intervention to even get in the program. Earlier on, when I had troubles with substance use disorder earlier on in my life, I dedicated my life to do work for the universe or God or source, whatever you would want it to, and that was an opportunity that opened up in my life. And I was like, okay, now you're actually going to study this. And sometimes research is me search. A lot of times we study ourselves and our experiences, trying to figure out how we relate to our reality. So I think that had a lot to do with it, but it was so much at a deeper level. I was guided to do it, looking back on it, as we all are when we look back at our lives.
Like grad school?
Graduate school, yeah, the graduate school program. And so adjusting to that, and basically Darwinistic publish or perish, intellect was your monetary value. And I was under the good mentors, and I had an excellent education. Then I ended up going to do my postdoctoral research fellowship at Washington State University, Vancouver, studying addictions, but at a different perspective. And we're targeting a different protein in the brain. And that ended up being a successful process as well. I ended up getting a grant, an NIH grant with National Institute of Health through the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And that was a big grant that has facilitated my training process. And through that process, I ended up getting trained at Oregon Health and Sciences University in Portland, Oregon, to learn a new technique that was part of the grant process and part of my training. And in the process of that training, I went on interviews and landed my dream job, which was a professorship at the medical school at the University of Kentucky. With my own laboratory with the NIH grant. And so I was headed there a year early before my training process was over. In the grant process, I had another year to learn, but I had gotten the job I wanted. But as I was going into this career and being successful and getting exactly what I thought would make me happy, I did notice that throughout this process, I wasn't getting the positive reinforcement that I did before with all of these things in my life, such as the publications and the data. And my soul got hungry. And as my soul got hungry, I started to dive into heart-brain coherence, how the heart works with the brain, how the spiritual stuff. I started going to shaman healer get-togethers in Portland, Oregon. I started to touch base with nature, and about my 35th birthday, there was a experience where I started to get in touch with nature, where the photosynthesis, the glow of the leaves and the palpability of just nature's energy started to really integrate with me. And that was the beginning of what had become a very powerful transformative spiritual process.
Wow. Wow. Portland is an incredible place for all that too.
It is. It's a huge activator. And I was living up on a hill, and theoretically there's a vortex there. So that was facilitating it. And I had a lot of rough edges. I was in therapy, and I was a workaholic, and I was drinking a lot to deal with that. And then my soul got hungry, and everything after that lined up to the point of what was an uncontrollable ego death. And the more I tried to hang on to my ego, the more it eroded, like holding on to sand, and that almost coming through your palm. The more you hold on to something, the quicker it deteriorates or leaves you. And that's what happened to my ego. And then one day I had this realization that I didn't want to do what I've already learned for the next 30 years. I wanted to continue to evolve. And that it was at a spiritual level. And I realized that I had become a scientist to find spirit. And I did that through my science. So I was able to
became a scientist to find spirit.
Yes. And I found spirit. And the next chapter of my life was to evolve at a soul level, not at an ego level. And that I had to see through some of the harsh realities that my research was very fancy. It had some flaws, and it wasn't ever going to actually heal the way I wanted it to heal. And it wasn't in alignment with this newfound connection to source, this new discovery of who I was as an individual. And through a very tumultuous process and some very long meditations for a few days in the woods, I made the decision. I had the right people come into my life and give me the courage and the reflections to let go of what I had worked for 15 to 20 years. Because what the person who actually was successful and created that career at the time I felt was non-existent. Now I realized that there's just more of me here. There's more, and getting more in touch with more part of your higher self as you anchor that in. There's more multifaceted, multi-dimensionality. But at the time, I just felt like that person doesn't exist. This is a completely, and I had to call them. That's what I told them. I called and said that the person you interviewed doesn't exist. And I told them I wasn't going, and I gave the grant back to NIH. Like, I think it was quite a significant amount of money, and I gave the grant back to NIH, and I had to. And
those grants are really hard to get. So that's kind of a big step.
Yeah, it was giving everything up. So I gave everything up, and I integrated for a year. And it ended up being what I later on found out was a spontaneous Kundalini awakening process. And those are quite volatile, and you can have a lot of disturbance in your life as a result of that. So I actually had to, and it can be.
I want you to say that one again. Spontaneous
Kundalini awakening process. And that's just, Kundalini energy is really source energy and all that is, but it can be activated in your body. And there's some really great yogic sciences that goes into great detail about that. I'm not going to go into that today, but I had to educate myself on that. And I found that out through the Spiritual Emergence Network and process, and some of the work of Stan Groff looking at all of these things. And I was able to figure out what was happening to myself, and I had the right people in my life to give me support, my mother, and go back to Michigan and integrate for a year and a half or so. And then I was called back to academia, and I taught for a year at the university, my first year as a professor, and I did some heart-brain coherence research, which integrated some of the spirituality aspects, and continued to integrate science and spirituality, which had to go within. It had to go from inside to the outside. For me to be able to gift that to the world, I had to integrate it within myself first. And that was the hardest. That was what I did, because I had such a strong intellect training, and it became more of a neurological imprint. It wasn't who I was. wasn't who I identified with. What I did and I did not identify with. So basically, I had to, in this newfound intuition, I had to balance that really strong neurological intellect imprint with that newfound intuition. And that's when I started to look at the heart-brain coherence and all these other things. And that's been an ongoing process. And then I was in the institution at the university for a year. I taught. It was very successful. I love my students, but the system itself wasn't prioritizing the values that I wanted. In an educational system, it wasn't prioritizing what I felt was most important. And I just wasn't happy there. I had this, what I've called divine discontent, where you have to really fulfill that soul part of yourself.
Yeah.
And I did that. And I had the right people come into my life that gave me the courage to walk away from academia. And I was like, this is crazy. I put all this work, I had the curriculum in there, but they're like, yeah, you know, listen. And so I decided to do what I had originally, upon the awakening process, built what that was, which is soul science. And that integrates science and spirituality in a way that I'm doing within to then be a gift to people without, as my personal process, to be a gift to humanity through love, and in a way that would bring me happiness and joy by bringing happiness and joy to other people. So that involves coaching, education, and science. And that's what I'm currently doing. So taking the coaching classes and integrating those processes. So yeah.
Wow.
It's a long story, I know.
Yeah.
But
actually, I was pretty impressed that you were able to get it down to 10, 15 minutes.
yeah, so we're good.
Yeah.
We made it to the time limit. So
Yeah.
any follow-up points?
Well, I have lots of questions, but I
Okay.
think they're going to be new videos.
Okay, that sounds good.